Thank you, Professor Rahul. And I want to first thank Energy Consortium, Professor Satya, Professor Nikhil, and and the team for a wonderful opportunity to talk here. And I think it's first of all a great initiative. Energy Consortium itself is a wonderful initiative, much needed, much timely, and to be led by an organization like IIT Madras. And we need a lot of technology leadership in the next few decades that we have to go through. I also thank CSTEP's director, Dr. Jay, and Dr. Arup, Chief of Research, for this opportunity. Now, CSTEP has been working on the PAT program. So my talk is going, we've heard a lot of lovely stuff today on a subject which is very wide, very broad, and has many complex, each issue is very, very complex, and there's a lot of diversity. So, which is why there's a lot of uncertainty, going back to Professor Rahul's question. We have been working 10 years back with Ajay Mathur and the Bureau of Energy Efficiency on the design of the PAT program. So the design of the PAT program is where what Anuradha spoke about, the methodology, and that's the devil which has all the details. And that also tries to, provide a direction to what Professor Rahul was asking. Is the way forward is methodologies need to be developed, and that's where academia in collaboration with the industry can play a very, very useful role. And that's what we did 10 years back while developing the methodology for PAT, but that was the methodology 1.0, so that was 1.2. And to some extent that has not really progressed even in the context of PAT, and when we talk about carbon markets, we really need something like 10.0, ideally. And so there's a lot of work to be done, a lot of ground to be covered till we reach a very good design. And I think the skill sets to develop such a technology is there in India, plus lessons, international lessons can always be taken. And also, it's going to be a work in progress. So it's not something that, just to answer Professor Rahul, it's not something which we found in, I come from an academic background myself, but then working in policy, you understand the transition and the, different stories that you have to deal with and try to bring positives from each into the other. So, the point became that when we were trying to develop methodology for PAT, there was a lot of issues, confusions. We were trying to bring 7 or 8 important sectors like steel and cement, paper, chloralkali, textile, all of them are different. And forget that, even within steel, there are about 100 plants, all of them are different. So we used to actually go to plants. I visited Tata Steel, JSW, SAIL plants, worked with the R&D center in Ranchi, had multiple rounds of consultations. And first of all, you have to get over start building those partnerships and networking. And that's it's a whole gradual process that happens. So today in my talk, we'll talk a lot about PAT and also to understand that as an example, as a case study of how we went about designing the methodology for PAT, how it got implemented, what are the lessons coming out of PAT. One is, yes, we get an understanding of PAT, but larger issue is to address Professor Rahul and what Anuradha and others have been speaking. What are the lessons coming out of that? What are the complexities involved in designing a carbon market, which seems to be the next step? So the stated goals we've all seen at COP26, so we have all those objectives to meet, and the EC Act was amended in 2022, and a national carbon market is envisaged. I will not be going through every piece of text in the presentation. This is provided so that it can be shared with participants, but I'll just highlight a few points here and there. So cement and steel were important from the context of PAT because they were the largest energy consuming sectors, 8% of CO2, 6% of CO2, but also energy-wise, cement was slightly higher because it has a lot of process emissions coming out of it. So while the CO2 percentages were 8 and 6, the energy percentages were, I think, more like 10 and 7. So cement was more because it has the calcination process which gives out CO2. Now, there were many design challenges when we look at PAT. And I'll just go back one slide. One of them was the sectoral diversity. The scale of, when you look at just the steel sector or the cement sector, the scale of production is different. Installed capacities are different. That has a huge impact on what the energy intensity of production is. And that was a key ingredient, key metric of what PAT is designed on. It is designed on the specific energy consumption, which is the gigajoules or the kilowatt hour or the MTOE per ton of product produced. So that was the chosen as the metric. So you have to actually first decide what's the metric that you're going to use. The key here is we could not use any cap, unlike the European case of allowances, because India had still to keep the international position that we are largely a growing economy, and we could not accept a cap on CO2 from industry, because industry's production would be ramping up. And overall, for example, in cement or steel or any of the other sectors, there's going to be a huge increase in production going forward in the next 20, 30 years, which again feeds into what Atif was talking about, the huge demand of buildings that is yet to be built. I mean, the famous cliche that 70% of buildings that will exist in 2050 is yet to be built. So, so PAT had to be designed around an intensity principle, not an allowance principle. So that was a fundamental thing, and that is also going to play a role in the design of our own carbon markets, because there has to be a lot of space given. So this is going to be a design principle. I'm just highlighting a design principle through the anecdote of PAT, that they will have to be allowance, enough flexibility within the carbon market, which allows India to grow for the developmental goals, for the poverty alleviation schemes, all of that to happen. So production, it's not the same case like in developed countries where production has largely plateaued, especially in sectors like steel and cement, which have largely plateaued. The other is, for example, the raw material input varied across industries. The quality of raw material, for example. Now, when you talk to steel associations or cement associations, they say, and this is from steel plant to steel plant, the quality of the coal that they are getting. India has a high ash content. Some of them are importing 10% of Indonesian coal, South African coal, Australian coal. So the mix is different. So then it becomes difficult to set a clear number in terms of what is exactly going to be your intensity target. So how do you set baselines is incredibly complex when you get into the details. The other is, in a baseline, you have a baseline year and you have an assessment year. In the baseline year, what is going to be the production? That was some production that was there. But the production might change in the assessment year. So that is a huge change that alters the dynamics. Not only that, the product mix changes. In Bhilai steel plant, in Jamshedpur, in Tata steel plant, the mix of flat steel versus steel bars versus other kinds of steel produced in, say, financial year 22-23 might be different 3 years later. So how do you account? And the kind of product produced affects the energy intensity of the used for making that product. So how do you account for all those kinds of variations within one plant between the baseline year and assessment year? So there are a lot of issues that we had to grapple with. And then, of course, the vintage of plants. So there are older plants, there are newer plants. There's a plant which has got an older sections. The iron making section, blast furnace may be old. The steel making is newer. They are adding a new blast furnace in the middle of the baseline and assessment years. How do you account for that? And that happened with the SR plant near Surat, where they were transitioning from a particular process and adding a BF, a blast furnace. So how do you account? There's so many variations that a company, an industry is a living organization. It is evolving day to day, year on year. So how do you actually account to set all these baselines? So one has to kind of take a step back while designing policy. One cannot be entirely mathematical about it, but one has to take into account, and make it acceptable to get people to buy in, all the stakeholders to buy in. And I think that was definitely a success of PAT, that it got all the associations, it also got all the ministries, everyone, and getting, I think, ministries to buy in was probably more difficult than getting the associations to buy in, because every ministry had its own competing, objectives. We also found a very interesting thing, that it was easier to get private sector plants on board in some cases compared to PSU plants. And intuition would have told us otherwise, because this was a government program. PSUs, really are not going to give that much of a pushback is what sort of conventional wisdom would tell us, but we found the counterintuitive, that private plants were more eager to jump on board. Moving on, I would talk about a couple of things on the methodology. We had to identify and notify industrial units. So how do you identify which are the steel plants going to be covered by a particular scheme? Which are the cement plants? Because there are hundreds of them. So then they set a notion of what is called designated consumers, which is, they set a baseline. They said if a steel plant is consuming more than 30,000 MTOE per year, then that would be a designated consumer. So that automatically, when you start, when we start dabbling in setting a methodology, we start quantifying things and we create a slab structure. Like Anuradha also pointed out somewhere else, that you have to set a line and say there's a slab like income tax slabs. But what is the rationale for setting 5 lakh as an income tax free thing? Why not 4 lakh 95? That question will always remain. It can never be answered to anyone's satisfaction, but we just have to take something to work with it. We have to create an animal and go with it. And then as we learn, we can refine it. So we cannot a priori, from an academic point of view, we cannot a priori design a methodology which can satisfy completeness and correctness in the field. That's never going to happen. So that's my answer to a lot of questions. It's going to be discovery, and it's going to be a collaborative, consultative effort of all the stakeholders involved. So I think PAT achieved many of those objectives, but there are a lot of lessons coming out of it, and whether those lessons have been learnt in PAT is kind of, many reports say that, they haven't learned some of those lessons, and some of the PAT schemes, the cycles that are going on right now have not learned some of those lessons. And there, I think, is the important lesson for all of us trying to talk about carbon markets, because carbon markets is a much more complicated issue than just about energy. Simply, as Anuradha pointed out, there's going to be so much of tradability. Also with Article 6 of the new act coming in, there's going to be international trade possible. There's going to be a lot of things which are going to be possible. Now, goals of PAT 1, we tried to achieve energy reduction target of 6.685. It was overachieved, as we all know. And reduction, there's a way that BEE has of calculating what the CO2 reductions. I know Nikhil asked me what is the formula for that, so that we'll discuss that offline. But largely it is about assuming an emission factor for 1 MTOE of coal, or even the fuel mix, maybe 80% coal largely and 20% electricity is the average rule of thumb in most of these big plants. So 80-20, so they would have taken some number like that and then taken an emission factor for the electricity separately and the oil separately, and then come out with the CO2 equivalent. Now, PAT cycle 2 also, for example, was overachieved. Here, the reduction target of 11.2, 13.28 MTO was actually saved. Again, overachieved by a lot. And investments of 43,000 crores were reported by many of the DCs. Again, in sector performance, I'll just show you that fertilizer and discoms were added in a much recent PAT cycle, and T&D losses of discoms, which is one of the most intractable, I think, academic and industrial problems in India, those were taken under PAT, and they did not achieve their targets. Fertilizer also could not achieve the latest PAT 2 targets, but all the other sectors have overachieved, and overachieved by a large percentage. And there was some corresponding emission reduction, which I will leave it to you to have a look later. So PAT, as we have seen, first was one cycle for 3 years, then it became a second cycle, and then they made it an annual cycle, and constantly every year adding new plants into the cycle. So adding new plants in 2 ways. One was called broadening, so adding more sectors, and one was deepening. Within a sector, adding more plants of that sector. These two were done. It's called broadening and deepening, and the reason is obviously, I mean, Rahul will understand, and many of the academics, is when you increase the diversity in a sector, more number of plants, then you can have a better shot at making a market mechanism more successful. But whether it did all of that is a matter of analysis. And I think, I was just sharing some concerns with Atif also on this, that some of the lessons of PAT have not yet been deeply analyzed at a research level, at a academic industry, higher and deeper level. And I think that would be, I would submit, one of the things that where Energy Consortium could also take a lead if there is bandwidth. But that is an open thing right now, and BE does not have enough of, it's not a research organization in that sense. So they have a lot of data, some lessons coming out of it, but it's not yet to a level where it can actually, they have not been adaptive enough to design an adaptive controller design to actually improve the future cycles of PAT based on the previous lessons. So this slide basically tells us that a lot of energy saving certificates were issued. There was very low price discovery happening because almost everyone has reached or exceeded their targets. There was very little demand to buy certificates, and so the price was very low. Finally, what did Ministry of Power do? So this is all answering a lot of the methodology in action, what actually happens. So Ministry of Power then said, okay, let's set a floor price, So let's go one by one. Let's now set a floor price and see what happens, Atif. So, let's see what happens. Dekhte hain kya hoga. So let's set a floor price. Acha, kya rakhenge? So now that's a debate, right? So either you can do modeling, or you can go by rule of thumb, or you have consultations with industry, or you can have another method to say that, theek hai, MTOE ka price itna hai, so let's put 10% of that. Is there any rationale for it? I mean, you could always reverse engineer and say there is, it makes sense. But I would submit that there are better ways of coming to these numbers and to see basically performance of the market. Where you set targets is very, very critical. Target setting. We work with so many plants. Some of the Indian plants are compared with the best in the world, so they had lower targets. Some of them are really inefficient, so they had much higher targets. But everyone seemed to be able to over-exceed their targets. So the target setting was an important lesson that left a lot of, and I was part of target setting. I mean, we were in 1.0, that's 10 years back, but after that I have been out of the loop, and BE also has not yet been able to refine that target setting approach. So target setting is critical, baselining is critical, a lot of things. And then what this basically shows is that, look at the blue graph here, which is the price discovery. Started off optimistically, plummeted, I think very much like what happened in Europe at, we probably remember that a decade or so ago. And then it started rising, must be a new PAT cycle ended, and there was a sudden flurry for a demand for that. And then it just came to rock bottom, and then the floor price was set, and then you can see it is trading at the floor price of 1840 fixed. I mean, this is truly not a market mechanism, right? This is just basically circuit breakers. Higher price, lower price, and it's supposed to operate between them, but then, so as one looks at it as a control problem, then of course you feel that, there is a lot of things that could be done. There are a lot of variables, there are a lot of moving parts in this, in designing a carbon market, designing even the energy efficiency market, the ESERT market, but carbon market is much more complicated. So critical issue in PAT, the very, very clear issue was there was a whole oversupply of certificates which are still there. Then people talked about, okay, let's set a extinguishing deadline for the certificates. Okay, people are having lakhs and lakhs of certificates, no value to them, so let's extinguish a few. Maybe, that will improve the price, because let's remove, बड़े लोगों के पास certificate बहुत है, तो let's remove, because people with deep pockets implemented a lot of those measures and they got lakhs and lakhs of certificates. So now let's remove some of them. Again, there needs to be a lot of research underpinnings, scientific, evidence-based underpinnings to all of this. And Atif pointed out the business undercase. You need to have finance, science-based underpinnings to how to extinguish, when to extinguish, how many allowances or how many certificates or to insert into the market if there's a deficiency of certificate. So you have to have both. So a stabilizing mechanism. Many things are. Many things are. Because they were talking about it. They haven't extinguished yet. But these are things that can be brought about. Because to ensure the stability of the market, as long as it is going to serve the interests of all the stakeholders, people will be on board. Because people.
Promissory estoppel. I put in money because you promised.
Right.
Or then you suddenly come up.
No, ETS, for example, has that. You can suck out from the market also, but at a price. Maybe they will pay them, but suck it out of the market. So the EU, in fact, we'll come to that in a minute. I'm just finishing up. So way forward is, that B is now talking. It's a very ambitious goal, but I feel that there's a long way to go in terms of learning, in terms of having a rigorous background to actually give those science-based policy inputs to BEE how to design a national carbon market. And simply looking at graphs from EU reports or a couple of World Bank reports are not going to sort of, and then going forward with a, let's try it out, let's see how it works. There's a certain amount of digging deep that needs to be done, certain amount of scientific rigor that needs to be done, and then yes, certain things will be learnt along the way. Now, for example, carbon tax, we also have a coal cess. So we have parallelly a trading system going on, we also have a coal cess going on in India. So that's very similar to a carbon tax. So, and then people are already talking, and BE announced when they announced the press information that BE is now going to have this carbon market that will eventually go to a cap and trade. Cap and trade is like very, very far away from a policy perspective. I've sat on the low carbon, I was a member of the low carbon inclusive growth committee at the time of Montek and Kirit Parikh, and I was heading the industry sector at that time. And the narrative that India always has at COP is that we are not going to cap our emissions, we're going to have net zero. But that is a net zero with offsets, right? So it's not a cap as long as our development goals, because that needs to continue. So now we are already saying we'll have a cap and trade. It's going to be very, very difficult. Now, EU, for example, has, as the other intern pointed out in his presentation, that they have a border tax thing. And border tax is a very, very critical parameter, not to be designed loosely. It has long-term implications. Let us say 50 years hence, we are a developed country. Now, we have a certain border tax mechanism. It may work against the economic interests of our country. So one has to design it very carefully. It cannot be just, sort of prescribed by BE today, and that remains for eternity, because that may be not working suitably. Europe has also brought about a social climate fund. Now, for example, when they say that we will have a tax on many of the products that are produced, many of the industries we have to guard against will pass it through to the cost of the product, pass it through to the consumer. Now, the market mechanism is supposed to be in, academic circles and financial circles, a mechanism to incentivize industry not to pass it on through to the customer, because every industry may have a different model of making those energy efficiency improvements, and their price points may be different. So in order to really compete in the economy in the market, on the price of their product, Ultratech, for example, may decide not to pass on the entire cost into their product of cement. Somebody else might say, chalo, we will bring in 40% of that, we will load it on our product. So market mechanism is a way for people among a sector, industries within a sector, to trade among themselves, and hopefully, ideal is supposed to lead to a very good price discovery. That has not happened in PAT because of, many of the reasons that we have looked at. I'm not trying to say that PAT design was not good. I'm trying to say that it was a very good design 1.0. There are lots of lessons that have come out. There's a wealth of data that has come out, but a lot of analysis is required, a lot of research is required in order to even design a better PAT market, let alone a better carbon market. And carbon market, I think Anuradha has done a good job to talk about, fungibility, how to transfer e-certs into, how do you convert that into carbon credits? How do you have RECs and carbon credits? How will these all interact? First of all, you need the ministries to talk to each other. That is a very important thing. Then you need to have the sectors talking to each other. And thirdly, you need to have this unifying methodology. So compliance has been one of the major issues. compliance, which means the whole compliance mechanism, which means baselining. And there's a certain time given for industries to give in and give their submissions in terms of what were our certified energy consumption intensities. And then people have asked for extension, 6 months, 1 year. So if you start becoming lax in terms of compliance, then some of the design parameters of your methodology are lost. This impacts the number of certificates. So everyone is now able to pass and get a gold medal, which is a good thing in a different context. But if you're designing a market, and if everyone is achieving, then you're not creating a market, because it has to be demand and supply. There has to be demand and supply. I mean, I'm just trying to point out realities because of the work we've done with them. So there has to be this demand and supply, and there has to be this also a very important thing that EU brought about is the market stability reserve. It's more of a fund. It's like a controller that can, it's like an RBI, something similar to an RBI or a SEBI, which can inject or remove allowances. But maybe, as pointed out, that it could be based, there are many ways of doing it, but some way to bring stability into the system so that you're not either at the floor all the time or at a ceiling all the time. Penalty mechanism, for example. Now this penalty mechanism has been a very weak thing in PAT. The penalty and the penalties for different kinds of violations of PAT are the same. So they have not got graded penalty systems. So there are many design parameters, credit caps, which sectors should be included, demand and supply, then compliances, then penalty mechanisms, adaptive design. There has to be an adaptive controller design. It has to be like a SEBI, like a Securities Exchange Commission. It's got to be like that, constantly monitoring the market, what's going on. But for that, you need a lot of research capability, which organizations like Energy Consortium can add on to that to provide that bridge between industry and people like BEE, who are tasked with doing a humongous job. I mean, it's a huge job. It's a tall order, very ambitious even in developed countries. It's far more ambitious in India. And so I think there are reports by other groups like Prayas and others in Pune and Delhi, Terry and CSTEP, which say that PAT is not yet a pat on the back yet, because it was a learning. It's great we have something going, we have learned a lot, but and a lot of monitoring, credit and BEE energy auditing system has been set up, compliance systems have been set up, but that has to now really get matured into a far better method of stabilizing the system, know how to, and also be slightly strict in terms of compliances. I think for 1.2, it was kind of low on the compliance and enforcement part, because I think acceptability was a major concern. Because I was part of a lot of the presentations done by BE to various industry organizations on and getting the buy-ins basically. So that is going to be a major concern going forward. And incentives. I mean, industries always, they're different industries, different. We heard from the SICI person today. A lot of incentives are needed. Or Atif was talking about how access to green finance. And it has to be linked to that. You can't just have a mechanism which says, okay, do this, implement this on your own. There are few people with deep pockets who can do that, but there are a lot of people in the middle who can't do that. So you have to provide access to green finance and things like that. And so with a very short time, I tried to give flavor of what we did in PAT, some of the lessons, some of the open loose ends from the academic point of view, which many of the questions that Professor Rahul asked, but also to say industrial reality is, very difficult to navigate policy. But I still feel that a lot of work needs to be done where, academically bright minds like EC, the kind of energy consortium collaboration, can actually contribute to taking this forward with a lot of linkages to financing. So thank you so much.
The last thing to be done is thank you, Dr. Krishnan. Thank you, Anuradha. Amazing insights. And this was really a nice classroom session for me. So lots of questions that I have noted. So hope to continue to work with you on all of these and each of these. So thank you. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for the audience. Any questions? We have very less time. Actually, we have crossed 5. How much time do we have? Okay.
See, the PAT
That time when you consider the PAT, nobody bother about the carbon emission, etc. Now with reality coming into carbon emission, you have to revisit the PAT. That's a reality. Whatever the PAT you have done earlier, it's going to be totally revisited. So probably I would like to have your views on this.
I would say actually that PAT has to be, excellent question, thank you. And I would say that PAT has to be revisited even for a better design of PAT. First, for the energy saving certificates part of it, reducing the energy intensity of, India sort of had pledged to reduce first 30% by 2030, then 45% by 2030 compared to 2005 levels. So even for the emissions intensity part of it itself, PAT has to be better designed and could be improved. There's always room for improvement. But that's why I was trying to delineate between the energy market and the carbon market, because carbon market becomes much more complex for a variety of reasons, and many of them Anuradha did a very great job of pointing it out. So it's going to be much more complicated. Some of the issues will be common, that you need a whole set of variables that have to be looked at, have to be dynamically controlled. It cannot be, and a lot of discovery and learning is going to happen. So AI, ML, those kinds of things, which academics like us, a lot of academics, we know about controllers and, control systems and learning and adaptive, all that is known to, but it's not happening in industry in that sense, in design of markets. And market design also is aware, people like SEBI and, things like that, but that kind of, I think, heavyweight effort needs to be put in to regulate and control, not regulate, but provide a good controlled level playing field. Yeah. Yeah, right now PAT is going on. So right now that is going on, but what they say is eventually it will lead to the national carbon market, which will eventually, and that eventually is a time, the time is unknown, will go to a cap and trade. Cap and trade, I don't see it anytime happening now because it's still going to be emission intensity based, but cap and trade at some point, yeah. Yeah, but India has an issue about because of the developmental goals, no? So that is still there. Yeah.
Sir.
First of all, thank you for the sharing. It was really very enriching to listen to your experience with the PAT program. Agriculture, forestry, and other land use, they also contribute significantly. Some of the IPCC reports say 25% of the global emissions happen from this sector. And India has a huge potential to manage GHG emissions from agriculture, forestry, and other land use. But at the same time, agriculture is mainly dominated by smallholders, farmers. So what kind of potential do you see, being an expert in all these schemes, and what kind of scheme could work better in AFOLU sector?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Good question. First of all, all of us are experts in our own field, so I'm, not claiming to be an expert. Second thing, yes, agriculture has a lot of emissions to offer and a lot of solutions also to offer. In fact, sinks also come from a lot of processes, for example, looking at biodiversity in trees. But agriculture itself has a lot of emissions coming out from different sources. It could be use of equipment, diesel, gensets, and a lot of different other emissions also. But then regulating and controlling that, and also looking at the kind of fraction that the potential for improvement. I think right now industries was high on the value chain, power sector and heavy industries, so that is why they were taken into PAT and not agriculture. But yes, going forward, there could be a scope for corporate bodies who are, say, in food processing or manufacture of processed food. Those, like, the levers and the various other groups that are there manufacturing processed food or which are reliant on agriculture but not directly in agriculture, those, yes, they could be coming under carbon markets eventually. But I think it will be a slow process. There's going to be a lot of growth happening, a lot of learning has to happen. So the learning happens not just by time passing, by passing, a flux of time, but also by taking those lessons and feeding back. And I think that's where right now I feel personally that that's the weak link in the chain of designing.
But again, depends upon the geography.
Absolutely.
For example, in Africa, Kenya and Uganda, a lot of afforestation is happening. There is a lot of importance
Right, right. Absolutely. Even in India, there are geographical diversities, in so many respects. Yeah.
One last question. Yeah.
Sir, in part scheme, for an interested consumer, they can voluntarily enter into the part scheme outside the DC. Is there any provision in that?
Right now, it is only mandatory. Mandated DCs, designated consumers, who have to be notified in the Gazette of India, and there's a whole procedure for all that. Till now, people haven't shown. There are people who are interested, so it may come up at some point. But I think they're talking about the voluntary carbon market, right? So in that sense, yes, this might come up.
Okay. Thanks once again. One last thing to be done is giving a small memento as our token of our appreciation. So. With that, we'll close the session. Thanks a lot.